Hi all, welcome back. And we're continuing talking about bone tissue. And we just left off last time talking about bone cells and how bones, what bone cells are associated with growth, and a little bit about what bone cells are associated with destruction. And we talked a little bit about Wolff's Law. And now we're going to talk more about how bone gets laid down, deposited, what does it mean to grow, and kind of the different types of growth that you would expect to see in bone. All right, so I mentioned this a little bit before, but bone marrow is the soft tissue that occupies the cavities of both long bones um, and flat bones. It's normally occupying the spongy bone region. And so bone marrow, I already discussed this a little bit, like it comes in kind of two forms: red bone marrow, which we call myeloid tissue. And this is a site of bone or of blood cell production. So it's hematopoietic tissue, or tissue that produces blood cells. And it's really important at young ages to have lots of this. And as you get older, of course, it's still needed, but it plays less of a function as you get older, and it's only found in distinct regions, like in the skull. So certain flat bones, like the skull, vertebrae, ribs, and then in some long bones in the heads of those long bones, like the humerus and the femur. Okay, but again, purpose: generate red blood cells, erythrocytes, generate white blood cells, although some white blood cells are generated in other regions also, but generate white blood cells, leukocytes, lymphocytes, these kind of things. And we'll talk a lot more about red blood cell and white blood cell in later lectures. Then the yellow bone marrow. It's primarily just found in adults, and it kind of replaces the red bone marrow. So where there was once red bone marrow, often as an individual ages, tends to become kind of yellow bone marrow, or the bone, that region, that soft, that spongy bone region would become compact bone. And so as you age, more of the bone becomes compact bone, but also more of the bone becomes yellow bone marrow. And it does not produce blood. Its function is really to hold energy, although it does provide a little bit of protection, a little bit of kind of insulation and protection from forces that might try to shear off a bone. It can be transferred back to red marrow if you are extremely anemic and need to produce a large amount of blood. The yellow bone marrow can be transferred back. But again, the purpose of the yellow bone marrow is to provide energy for continuous production of either red blood cells and some white blood cells, or also for that kind of continuous turnover that we see in bones, because your bones aren't stagnant. They're not just staying as compact bone. That bone material is being recycled and relayed down all the time. Okay? Ossification, osteogenesis, the formation of bone. Okay, so there are two main ways at which this can occur, and I kind of already talked about this briefly, but we're going to go in much greater detail on how this is done. In flat bones, we call it intramembranous ossification. Okay, and that is associated with stem cells. And then in long bones, it's called endochondral ossification, and that's associated with cartilage. Okay? And so we'll look at both and kind of how they differ. Okay? Both really do begin with stem cells. It's just in one case you're laying down cartilage, and then the cartilage is being ossified. In the other case, you're just laying down osteocytes or osteoblasts, which then become osteocytes, and the material is laid down that way. Okay, and we'll look at both. Okay, so the first is that intermembranous ossification. So you have these mesenchyme cells. We already kind of talked about them. Mesenchyme cells are stem cells. They haven't really differentiated necessarily to be bone cells, but they can become bone cells. And in the case of where we're talking about intramembranous ossification, they are going to be bone cells. Okay, so the osteoblasts, the mesenchyme cells become osteoblasts. The osteoblasts then ring and form kind of a ring of osteoblasts, and they produce osteoid tissue on that outer ring. So they're encasing themselves. Okay, once they've encased themselves completely, remember they become osteocytes. Okay, they're getting the energy and the nutrients and the oxygen from the blood vessels that are nearby in order to do this. So the first kind of step is to deposit osteoid tissue into the embryonic mesenchyme. So the mesenchyme is this region where there's going to be mesenchymal cells, okay, and nutrients, proteins, lipids, other things in solution. And so the first step is to kind of deposit that osteoid tissue in that region. Okay. The second step is to start to calcify that osteoid tissue. Okay, and now the entrapment begins. Okay, the osteoblasts that were laying down that osteoid tissue become encased, okay, entrapped in the material that they laid down that is now starting to become calcified. Okay, and so that's going to be the attraction of calcium phosphate to the region. Okay, hydroxyapatite is going to lay those crystals down on the collagen fibers. Those crystals are going to build. Some calcium carbonate is going to be attracted. Some other ions are going to be attracted, and you're going to start to get a calcified structure around those once osteoblast sites cells, okay, which are going to be called osteocytes now. Okay. Then after that, okay, then what you have is you have this peristenium that is going to kind of encase that region. Okay, and so you might have a mesenchyme on the outside still, and then you have this kind of barrier, and that barrier would then allow for spongy bone to start to form. And so you're going to get that tuberculae, you're going to get the spiracles that are forming that make spongy bone up in this region. Okay, so there's going to be lots of open space. You're going to have some blood vessels that are running through here, nerves will be running through here, but it's going to be encased with a peristenium. Okay, and remember, this is how flat bones are made. So you see a peristenium on top and a peristenium on the bottom with spongy bone in between. Okay, and then you get that compact bone. So a portion of that spongy bone is now being ossified even further. The lamellae, the gaps, are being filled in with more bony material, and it's becoming compact bone. So you still have the peristenium, compact bone, spongy bone, compact bone, peristenium, with mesenchymal cells on the outside. Okay? And so this is how flat bones are typically generated from like a juvenile phase, from a young stage of life. Okay? Now let's look at how endochondral ossification works. Okay? A little bit different because it's a cartilage model. So you're going to have cartilage, chondrocyte cells laying down cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is going to be laid down. In this case, the chondrium will encase it, and then hyaline cartilage will fill in the material. Okay, so you'll have these chondrocyte cells, which are laying down the cartilage, building these hyaline cartilage fibers. Right? Just like we see when we're talking about the tips of the bones and how the ends of the bones where they interact with each other is going to be filled in with hyaline cartilage, so that friction is there. Same kind of deal, but now it's the entire kind of bone. Okay, it starts off that way. Okay, there will be some ability for blood vessels to penetrate, so you'll have cavities that form through the pericardium into this new kind of chondrocyte matrix, hyaline cartilage matrix. You're going to start to have now blood vessels that encounter it. Okay? When the blood vessels encounter it, that can bring calcium and phosphate or hydroxyapatite to the region, okay, and that will start that ossification kind of process, and you'll start to get ossified material. You'll start to get spongy material occurring, or spongy bone occurring in kind of that bone associated with bone marrow region. And then on the ends, this is the important part. This is how bones lengthen. Okay, you have this epiphyseal zone, epiphyseal plate, where you have these cartilage cells, still have these cartilage cells laying down cartilage. Okay, and then you have a zone of metaphysi where that cartilage is becoming bone. Okay, so you have this zone where the bone is extending via cartilage. Okay, and then behind that zone, that cartilage is becoming ossified and becoming bone. Okay, and so if we look at it a little bit further on, okay, so when we look at the difference between, say, a young child's bone, maybe under the age of 16, okay, and an adult bone over here, you can see this epiphyseal plate where you have this region where cartilage occurs. It's laying down new cartilage fibers. Those cartilage fibers are going to become bone. Right? It starts off as spongy bone first, and then can generate into compact bone based on kind of the stress that's put on the bone. And that's referred to as the epiphyseal plate. Okay? When we transition into an adult, basically after the age of 16 for most females, and then after the age of really around 20 for most males, this epiphyseal line forms, and that epiphyseal plate is gone. No more cartilage is being laid down. The bones are not extending any longer. It doesn't mean they're dead. Okay, they're still getting nutrients. It's still bone tissue. If you break it, it still will repair itself, but you're not extending, you're not lengthening the bones. And that's really kind of how the two bones differ in the way that they are built and grow, for that matter. So let's talk a little more about growth and remodeling. Okay, it's continuous. Okay? A lot of students find that this is kind of new to them when they hear that your bones are continuously remodeling. They understand that their bones grow for a period of time, and then we're determinate growers. So other organisms are what we call indeterminate growers. They grow forever. Okay, so like fish, name a fish, a great white shark. It grows its entire life. It's not a determinate grower. So it's shark's not a good one because it's all cartilage, but let's just pick like a trout or a salmon or something like that. They grow through their entire life. Their bony material, hey, it always has cartilage associated with it a little bit, and so they can keep extending those bones. They can keep stretching those bones, the bones that need to be kind of stretched and grown that way. We are determinate growers. We stop growth at a certain age, but that doesn't mean we don't replace and remodel our bones. We do, and it's important to know that elongation may stop. Okay, once the epiphyseal plate goes away and becomes a line, the elongation period is done. Right, but the growth and remodeling still occurs. Okay, so you have this transitional zone. I already talked about it, where cartilage is being laid down and then it's being replaced by bone, and that's the metaphysia. Okay, so five main zones. Okay, you have the kind of the first zone where you might have some stem cells, chondrocytes that are associated with this, where new cartilage is kind of being developed, and new cells are being generated. And then you have proliferation, so you have all these chondrocyte cells, these cartilage cells being copied and making copies of themselves and just mass producing themselves. Hypertrophy, that's where they're going to start producing lots of fibers, the hyaline fibers, and going to start laying down cartilage. And then calcification is when those fibers are going to start having seeds, hydroxyapatite seeds form on the cartilage, and calcium is going to be attracted to that region, and you're going to get the calcified structure. And then eventually that calcified structure is completely transferred over from cartilage into bone, and then that's what we call the bone deposition part of that zone. Okay, and we'll look at kind of a diagram of this here shortly. So if we take an x-ray of like a child's hand, we can see these epiphyseal plates in the hand. If you kind of know what you're looking for, you can tell that it's cartilage and not bone. It's easier to see if there's a little different dye associated with it, but you'll have plates all along the phalanges and all along really every bone. Will have, every long bone will have a region where cartilage is being laid down in that epiphyseal plate, and then you have bone that is originating behind that, right? And then you kind of get a compact bone zone and a spongy bone zone within the bone. Okay? The reason why I like to show this diagram is in this region out towards the tips of the fingers, the epiphyseal plate becomes an epiphyseal line first. So you start from the extremities, moving your way back. So the tips of the extremities will become plates and become adult bones before, say, the wrist or the regions that are further away from the extremities. They tend to stay juvenile for a longer period of time. So breaking a finger, a digit, may not damage the epiphyseal plate, but breaking your wrist at the age of 12 could damage that epiphyseal plate. And the reason we bring that up is damage to a growth plate can cause a change in how that bone forms. So remember, these bones are extending, they're elongating, and if you break a growth plate, it can cause that bone to become shorter. And so if it occurs on like a hand or in an arm or something like that, you could have one arm shorter than the other arm, or one hand shorter than the other, or one finger, etc., shorter than the other. And so it is of concern often with children when they break a limb or something like that, uh, that epiphyseal plate is healed as much as possible, and hopefully that it allows for that elongation to still occur. But sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes the limb will be shorter than the other limb. All right, so let's look at these zones real quick. So the zone of reserved cartilage, again, this is kind of where all these chondrocyte cells are going to be hanging out, not necessarily multiplying, but going to kind of be just what it says. It's a reserve of cartilage. Right? Then you have this zone where the chondrocytes are going to be multiplying. That's proliferation. Okay, so they're going to start dividing and multiplying as much as possible. Okay, hypertrophy is the region where the chondrocytes will start to get larger, much larger. You can see here in this kind of zone here, you can see that they're much larger cells here than they were here. Here they're dividing and multiplying, and they don't have to get very large. In this zone, in the zone of hypertrophy, they're getting larger. Okay? And when they get larger, they're starting to lay down more cartilage or have more cartilage associated with them. Then you have those large cells start to attract calcium and phosphate, and they start to be calcified. Okay, and so that you get this hyaline cartilage will start to have calcium bind to it. Okay, and so you get calcification that occurs, and then after that, okay, you get osteoblasts that can form and start laying down material, and osteocytes will start to get encapsulated. Okay, so this really has to do with breaking down lacunae walls and opening up channels and things like that, and the chondrocytes will die and then be replaced with bony tissue. Okay, but nonetheless, it has to do with cartilage transferring over to bone. Okay? And so these cartilage cells will give rise to bone cells, and the bone cells will take over, and then that material becomes spongy bone. And then we've already talked about, well, how does it transfer from spongy bone to compact bone? And this has to do with stress that's put on the region will often determine what is going to be compact bone and what's going to be spongy bone. Okay, next time we'll talk about some disorders and diseases that are associated with this.